And what I will do tonight, or attempt to do tonight, is to talk about two things. One is coastal engineering and the other is resilience, and to look at the role that coastal engineering can play in coastal community resilience. And I will start with this. The edge, the shoreline, is where all the action is, and that's where coastal engineering practices. And there is a lot going on, but certainly coastal engineering is not going to solve all the problems. We know that we have a lot invested in our coasts in terms of communities that are old, that are established, that are important. Real estate values are very high. We have ports and industries along our coast, and we identify with the coast very strongly. So what does coastal engineering do? Coastal engineering essentially allows us to define and quantify the hazards along the coast and to help inform decisions that are made about our coastline. And I will also say, if anyone has any questions as we go through this, feel free to ask. You can hold them till the end, or you can ask as we go. So I'm free to deal with either way. But there is always a but. And the but is that coastal engineering is not going to solve all of our coastal management problems. I know some engineers that think that it does, but I tend not to fall into that category. I will also say that just as coastal engineering won't solve all the problems, regulations don't solve all the problems, the free market doesn't solve all the problems. We really need a more coordinated effort. So the big issue with coastal engineering and coastal management is not so much how to do something, but whether to do it and where to do it. And engineering tends to focus on the how, and sometimes that gets us in trouble. So we really need to focus on the whether and the where. And the hard part in all this is to know where it is appropriate to try to resist these hazards that coastal engineers can quantify, and where it is more appropriate to step back and just avoid the hazards. So this is the age-old dilemma along the coast. And we talk about holding the line, and in some locations that is probably appropriate, but we need to be careful what we ask for. This is a photograph of New Jersey. On the other side of that wall is a beach, and clearly this is not the kind of engineering practice that I like to see, and I suspect that you like to see. So it becomes a matter of how dedicated are we to holding this line, and what do we want our shoreline to look like. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with the fact that to have any kind of reasonable solution to our problems along the coast, we need different groups and different interests to be involved. And you'll see that I put coastal engineers at the very bottom. We are one of the groups that will be involved, but certainly we are not the most important. And it is the managers, it is the property owners, it is the government officials and the scientists and the engineers. I won't say are afterthoughts, but certainly we are not driving the process, or we should not be driving the process. These should be decisions that are made at the state and local level, and we are here to help. And I always tell people, remember that yesterday's decisions turn into today's problems. And today's decisions turn into tomorrow's problems. This happens to be a house in North Carolina, and we have many of I'm from North Carolina, we have many homes in a position like this. They were built at one point in time, the shoreline has receded. The buildings were tall enough and on a strong enough foundation that this is the result. The septic is gone, the access is gone, utilities are compromised. This is not a habitable structure, and it becomes a problem. Many property owners just walk away, and that leaves the community trying to figure out what to do. Eventually a storm will come along and take care of this, or someone can do it before that. But what we do is a problem. We also need to remember that it's not just buildings. Where we put buildings in harm's way, we also have population in harm's way. This is a photo that I took after Hurricane Sandy on Staten Island, and I want you to look at the sign here. This was a pole that was right outside a cottage that washed away. 3 people stayed in the cottage during Sandy. 2 died and 1 survived. And the Verizon crew that was restringing lines, setting poles and restringing lines, said, "We are very sorry for your loss." And it kind of brings it home. We're not just talking about buildings. So what can coastal engineering do? Coastal engineering can do several things. The first is it can help us to define what our design loads and conditions are for our structures, and that could be a building type structure or another type structure, but it's to help define those conditions against which we will be designing. Coastal engineering can also evaluate or help to evaluate erosion control structures, and these come in a variety of flavors, but basically what they try to do is either modify the hazard to which a building will be subject, or to somehow resist that hazard and protect what's behind it. So coastal engineering gets involved in that. Coastal engineering can also be involved in what I call reviewing gadgets and the silver bullets, which we've probably all seen. Some mad inventor somewhere will come up with a device that is going to solve the problem. It's going to be cheap. He thinks it's cheap. To the buyers, it is not necessarily. But we have a lot of these things out there, and coastal engineering is pretty simple when it comes right down to it. We have waves, we have tides, we have water that's moving, we have sediment that moves. We can relate one to the other, and we can see if something like this makes a difference. Many of these gadgets will perform when you do not need them, and they will not perform when you do need them. Monitoring these devices is problematic. Documentation of their performance is problematic. But coastal engineers can actually get into that. And coastal engineering can assist the people that have to plan and manage our communities. This happens to be a community in East Rockaway called Auburn by the Sea. Does anyone know that community? It was written up in the New York Times, and this community did not flood during Sandy, mostly because they brought in a lot of fill in this area and elevated all the buildings and the roads and so forth before they developed. So suddenly they were the hot item in that part of New York. You can see the boardwalk on the lower right was damaged in this location, as most of the boardwalks were, but the buildings were fine. So this was a case where the engineers and the planners and the developers got together and thought about what they wanted to do, the level of performance that they wanted from their buildings. And the other thing that coastal engineering can help us to do is to buy time. This is an example of a beach nourishment project where sand is added to the beach. In this case, it was dredged from an offshore source. This is Palm Beach County, Florida. And that kind of resets the clock, and it lets the erosion start again. At some point, of course, you will have to do this again. So it buys you time, it costs you money. It is an economic decision and a natural resource decision whether to proceed with this, and sand source is also a problem. Parts of Florida are actually running out of sand. So they are now facing the situation where they've been putting sand on the beach for 30, 40, 50 years in places, and they are running out of sand to do. They are importing sediment from the Bahamas. They are truck hauling sand from inland pits. Really tears up the roads, and the neighbors don't like that. But at some point, we're going to run out of sand, and then what do we do? So that's something to consider. Now, what can coastal engineering not do? Coastal engineering will not give us inexpensive solutions that satisfy all of our requirements. I don't even know if this lower circle even overlaps the upper two. I don't know if we can ever get to this little point right here. So just about anything that a coastal engineer does, hold on to your wallet. And nothing is cheap, very little is permanent, and we need to look at the resource issues, and we need to look at what the actual performance of these structures is. So we cannot be all things. But we do have some tools at our disposal which make it easier for us to do things. For example, we have flood maps, and everyone complains about flood maps, but we have no alternative in most cases. And they provide us with basic information on water levels and wave conditions that we can then use for design and evaluation purposes. So we have that, and it is good. We also have history. In the case of Rhode Island, if we look at the historic hurricane tracks, we can see what has occurred in the area in the past, and we know that it will happen again. So we have studies, we have maps, we have some data, and we should be using it. And if we actually use the information at our disposal, I think that we can do a pretty good job in designing structures and buildings that will withstand some design condition. We can do that. The issue is more defining that condition than it is designing for it. The unfortunate thing is Mother Nature does not read flood maps, does not read building codes, does not know a wind map, doesn't know any of this. And we frequently see floods and storms that exceed our design conditions. The photo on the left was taken after Hurricane Ike in Texas. This is Bolivar Peninsula, east of Galveston. There were 6,000 buildings on the peninsula before Ike struck. After the storm, 4,000 were gone. 4,000 out of 6,000. Of the remaining 2,000, all but about 200 were damaged. And in this photo on the left, you can see one that survived, and the hurricane shutters worked just fine. The rest of the building needs some attention, and you can see that the neighbors are all gone. So the flood levels here were generally 3 to 5 feet above the BFE. And that's why we had the scope and scale of the damage that we saw in Ike. The photo on the right was in Mississippi after Katrina. That is actually the landward building of a two-building pair. The first building is entirely gone except for the concrete columns and slab. And you can see that the building that remains, the first floor, was basically gutted. So we can always have a design that exceeds, or a storm that exceeds our design conditions. You don't know how many people I met in Mississippi who told me, my house survived Hurricane Camille in 1969. They told us it would never be any worse than Camille. Couldn't be any worse. So we stayed, or whatever, and Katrina came along and it was worse. I met several people who went swimming out of buildings that were collapsing. One guy told me he was swimming around with his dog and he saw bushes and he didn't know where he was. Those bushes were the tops of the trees. So we need to be careful. Don't fool ourselves into thinking that yes, we can design and we can do everything we need to do, because chances are something will come along and it will exceed what we expect. So we need to account for that and plan for that in our decisions. And this talk is really more Zen in the art of coastal engineering than it is coastal engineering. And I have digressions in here. This one is kind of philosophical, and it gets at the issue of what we should be building at the coast. If you look at a building code, if you look at flood regulations, we always have minimum standards. You have to build so high, you have to build so strong. But is that what we should be doing? Should we be placing maximum standards on buildings instead of minimum standards? Okay, go build a shack. If it washes away, who cares? We haven't done that yet. Should we do that? I don't know. What should we do with infrastructure? How should we design that? What should we be designing for? And the big issue is existing development. It is easy to talk about new development and designing to resist and avoid and all this stuff, but what do we do with all of our buildings and infrastructure that are already in place, that were They've been there for decades. So this is the biggest issue that any community will face right here. And unless a storm comes along like a Katrina or an Ike and literally wipes out the whole community so that the community starts over, not that that's a good thing, unless that happens, you will be faced with how do we deal with damage to existing structures? What do we do with them? So we also have the philosophical issue of erosion control structures. And we've been talking a lot about this in committee meetings, and should these structures be designed to correspond to the expected lifetime of the building that's behind them? Should they protect that building and no more? Should they protect the land? Should they protect the road? What is our expectation for these structures? I can tell you that every single property owner on the shore, if they can afford a structure, they will put out the most massive structure they can because they don't care. They want their land to stay there. They hope their building will stay there. If their building gets wiped out, they will rebuild taller and better. I ask people after a lot of storms, would you rebuild here? And I have had one person in 20 years say no. Everyone else says yes, but I would do it differently. So people are not going to willingly abandon the coast. They are not going to willingly give up any rights, real or perceived, to erosion control. It's going to be a struggle. Some states have said, okay, we're going to avoid the problem with seawalls and bulkheads and revetments and hard erosion control structures. We're going to let people put sandbags out. These things are temporary. Well, you can see the photo on the right. This was the South Carolina approach, where the state limited the size of the sandbags. They didn't want these bags to be so large and so durable that they would last forever. And what do you think happened? They scattered like the wind. This is Isle of Palm, South Carolina. These bags were small, size of this or a little bigger, and they littered the beach for miles. So that was not a good solution. It's a good theory, well, let's limit what people can do, but the consequence was this. So South Carolina has since gone and said, okay, you can put in bags that are 1 cubic yard. And the contractors get these bulk material bags that are cubic in shape. They put sand in them, they sew them up at the top, they set them out, and they roll around. These are not good bags. The state of South Carolina is still trying to figure out what to do. On the left side, we see the North Carolina approach, where we have the large bags that are shaped more like sandbags. And there is one building in the state that has had sandbags in place on a temporary basis for over 15 years. Once these go in, property owners are not going to let them go. They will get renewals for their temporary approval. They will ignore efforts to remove them. They will continue to replace them. And functionally, they are no different than a rock revetment. The advantage is you could go out there with a knife and you could slice one of these open, and at least you would have sand on the beach. So in that sense, it's more temporary. But when someone talks to you about a temporary solution or a soft engineering solution, don't believe them. So all that has to do with existing conditions. But the problem is the world is changing. We know sea level is rising. We think storms may be getting more severe. We really don't know. We need to move our designs from existing conditions to future conditions. And I think as a first order approximation, we can probably do that if we have a well-defined trend that we can use for design. And the classic example is going to be sea level rise. If we just extrapolate that historical trend, it is certainly better to do for design purposes than to ignore that trend entirely. And there are some design standards for critical facilities, national design standards, and the recent flood risk management standard executive order that came out that incorporates sea level rise. So we are dipping our toe in the water on this one. But the big problem, of course, is we see graphs like this. We don't see that extrapolation of a linear trend. We see an acceleration of sea level rise some decades out. And when people see this, They either don't believe it or they freak out. And the result is that there is a lot of uncertainty. A lot of uncertainty when we look at something like that. Sure, we can make predictions, but how real are those predictions? We won't know for decades. That's the dilemma. So we have to do something about that, and unfortunately our society does not deal with uncertainty well. And in order to wake you up at this point in the program, you will see the first of my limericks. Ken Filarski knows some of my limericks. So here we go. The sea is rising, they say, so we'd best get out of the way. How high should we go? We don't seem to know, and it leads to great dismay. I mean, that kind of summarizes the state that we are in with sea level rise. We know it's happening. We don't know what the extent may be. We don't know what to do. And we wring our hands, we fight, we talk about causation, we do all this stuff. But we need to start incorporating this into our designs. So back to resilience. What do you think communities should do, given everything we just talked about, or I've just talked about? What are your thoughts? This is the speaker pause in the program to extract opinions from the audience. Are our communities resilient now? Yes or no? No. So what needs to change?
Either we move back inland, or we go higher, or we just stay there and suffer.
Okay.
We need to change the attitude to get out and convince the people that they need to be resilient. We could work on regulations at the zoning level. Would be a whole. The communities have to get their arms around that, and they don't always do that.
Mm-hmm.
Make it so they,
Go ahead.
make it so that once a building has been destroyed, it's not allowed to be rebuilt in that same location.
Do we have any attorneys in the room?
There's a few.
There are a few. Yes.
I think when we talk about resiliency, part of it is fear, and I think people fear what they don't understand. So education, to me, is one of the cornerstones of what you're talking about here to help communities be more resilient.
Education is good. Education is necessary. And if we knew what was going to happen, it would make it easier. But we don't.
Hearing you speak about the uncertainty and some of the things that you do know helps to educate. Because there are no black and white answers. There's a lot of gray.
Right. Mostly gray.
Mostly gray.
Mostly gray. Yes.
Provide a financial incentive to do something differently, and also make risk management very expensive to stay stasis, to continue the stasis.
Okay. Make it expensive to stay and give incentives to do something rational. Isn't that what Biggert Waters tried to do? How'd that work out?
We'll find out.
Start moving the public infrastructure to set a new standard for the private landlords. Move it away, move it higher, build stronger.
Okay. Ken?
Well, I'm more and more convinced that building bigger, stronger, tougher is not the approach. Because Mother Nature is always going to be stronger. We need to understand the dynamics, the paths of least resistance, and also sort of resilient jujitsu.
That might be a limerick. Anyone else? Yes.
I just agree that we need to offer attractive alternatives to staying in harm's way. And I don't know how it is, but it does need to be a combination of having to take ownership of, rather than laying on the taxpayers with subsidized insurance, take ownership of the cost of staying on the coast, and also offer people, because it's everyone's biggest investment, offer people an attractive alternative to remaining here somehow.
And I could be a cynic, which I am, and I could say we can give people money to do things to entice them to do, but on the other hand, it's taxpayers' money usually, right? Where's the money going to come from?
So
that was what I was going to say, that we know there's a lot of uncertainty, but we know sea level is probably going to continue to rise, and even if it doesn't, there's a lot of resilient enhancement that needs to get done anyway. And the only and we know how to do much of it, and moving it back and up is pretty clearly part of the solution. And the only real issue is who pays and to do that. And there's a lot of complexity in that, but addressing what's fair in the cost sharing, I think, is really the central question.
Other people's money is always good. Yes.
Well, it seems to me that when you have large uncertainty, you can always quantify the uncertainty, and rather than having deterministic inundation maps, you could at least have probability areas, and people could make their decision based on at least a measure of risk.
Right. And I will tell you that I sit on FEMA's Technical Mapping Advisory Council, which was formed by Congress as part of Bigger Waters. And we've been charged with two things. One is trying to make maps more accurate, and the other is to make flood insurance more affordable. And I don't know how we're going to do on either of those. But the one issue that we've talked about a lot is uncertainty. And how do we deal with that? Do we bury it in the map, basically raise the BFE to account for some of that? Or do we tell someone that this number is very uncertain and it's probably plus or minus 30% if we're lucky or whatever? But the public and the engineers and the surveyors and the communities, I think by and large, they want a number. But then they get upset when you give them a number which is too large. So we're still wrestling with that one. I'm going to move on. I'm sure we'll come back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little different tact on resilience. I'm going to go back and look at an article that was in the Miami Herald after Hurricane Andrew hit in 1992. And one of the reporters went to Charleston, South Carolina, and talked to the people there who had been through Hugo in 1989 and said, okay, what have you learned? What should we be doing? You know, how can our community respond? And I think this is actually a good takeoff point for a resilience discussion. So the first lesson from Hugo was you will recover, but you won't forget. I mean, it's a very painful, long process, and people do not forget it if they go through it. The second one, that gets a chuckle. Third one, the economy will bounce back, sort of. You will have winners and losers, and you may have more losers than winners. This one is sad, but it's true. How many people after Sandy were depressed? Lots of people. So we need to address each of these, I think, if we are going to get resilient communities. But before we go there, I have limerick number 2, and this is about we never learn. We seem to repeat our mistakes, no matter how high the stakes. The floods come and go, we forget what we know, and our basements turn into lakes. So this is a view in New York after Sandy, one of the subway stations. Now I'm going to give you a quiz. I'm going to show you 3 quotes. I'm going to ask you which storm is being described. If you have taken one of my coastal construction classes, you know the answer if you haven't forgotten it, and you are prohibited from responding. Everyone else is free to respond. So the first one talks about quality of construction issues. The second quote talks about designers, how we can do things with hair-splitting accuracy, and then the structure just gets built how it gets built. And the third one talks about building codes and the value of codes. So what storm do you think was being described there? Andrew. Everyone always guesses Andrew, or every time I ask this question, I get an Andrew, I should say that. Any others? Galveston, any others? I'm looking for one answer.
38.
38. Any others?
How about Katrina?
Katrina,
Carol?
Carol. That's the one I want, all the above. That is a cover your ass answer. I will not accept it. And eventually, I always get that one from someone. We know who the troublemaker is. 1926 in Miami. So I guarantee when I get on teams and we go out and we look at storm damage, we could write 90% of the report before we ever go on the field. And it's because we know that we're going to have these same things going on. And we've been talking about this for 90 years, maybe more. So at some point we need to learn our lesson and stick with it. So now let me go back to resilience. In keeping with the Miami Herald article, I'm going to propose that these aspects will result in resilient communities. First, we minimize the damage that we see during a design level event or even an event that exceeds design. Is that okay? Number 2, recovery is quick. Does that sound good? Number 3, the entire population recovers, not just those that can self-fund. I don't know how many people I talked to a year after Sandy, still waiting on insurance money, still waiting on a claim to be resolved. I mean, still waiting. Very, very sad. The physical and mental health of the population are stable, at least as crazy as we are now, hopefully not any worse. The economy does not take a hit, and recovery is coordinated. Everyone works together, policies coincide, timelines coincide, life is wonderful. That would be good. And we actually learn. So last question for you. Which one of the Miami Herald items was missing from my list? You laughed at it before. Paperwork. I am not so hopeful that we will do away with paperwork. And as a matter of fact, I have the last limerick of the night dealing with that. And this originated from an email I got from a company I was trying to get a contract with, and I actually had been accepted for work, and then they started saying, oh, we just need a little more paperwork. So I wrote a limerick. There are a few updated forms needed as well. That was the direct quote. So you are now entering paperwork hell. It sucks you in, and you cannot win no matter how much you yell. So if we could do everything but the paperwork part for resilient communities, I would be happy. I don't know about you. I think we would have done well. So any questions, discussion?
Chris, thank you for your presentation. So in the Bolivar example after Ike, where surge